Hello, welcome to another EagleSix video, and we're going to be testing this customer's Tokyo Marui Scar L that was sent from faraway lands to us to get repaired. He's struggling to get it sorted locally himself, so we said that we'd have a look at it for him, and obviously we've got a bit of a essay, a few pages of problems with this particular one that we had to go through and check for him. So, but we like to think we've sort of gone over and caught those. But in a nutshell, it's been around a few techs. Sometimes you get guns like this that just kind of bounce around a bit. And truth is, no disrespect to any other gun techs, you cannot be fantastic at everything. It's just, you know, each and every one, especially if you've not worked on a gun before, it's going to be a new learning process, the same as it would be for any mechanic working on you know, any car for the first time. They're gonna, you know, just because you've worked on 100 BMW doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be fantastic on a Ford something or other. It might require a special tool or a special technique to get in there, which means it's going to take 10 times longer on that first time round. The second time round a little bit quicker, third time around even quicker than that, but still it's a learning process, and that's not a bad thing as such, you know, per se. On just gun techs in general, if you know what I mean, that's just a thing and how it is. So and obviously any gun tech that's out there that's saying that they're fantastic at everything, well, that's, you know, that's I suppose there's egos out there, but me personally, I'm quite happy to admit, if you know what I mean, that there's some guns that we're obviously fantastic at, you know, the next gen stuff, and there's other guns like normal V2s and stuff like that, which we just don't see a large volume of. So therefore, we just can't possibly be as good as somebody else that's doing 50 a week, say for instance, of a particular gun. And I think it's important that nobody tries to say that they're that good at everything. So because obviously it puts you know, them in a bad position, if you know, where they're potentially having to work on something that you know, they know little or not a lot of. So so yeah, long story short, we obviously took it all apart and just obviously went through to see what kind of problems it was. So I think originally it's tried to have some sort of gate or pico or something installed. With regards to picos, warfets, stuff like that, these next generation recoil shocks, in fact any in my opinion, AEG, any time that you have the opportunity to get an ETU, an internal MOSFET, something that will go inside of the gearbox and not outside of it. The majority of these guns, you cannot change the shape of what they look like. So you cannot make a giant battery space and then an AK-47. It just, by design, it has to look like an AK-47, or it has to look like an M4 or an Uzi. And then somehow you've got to shoehorn or literally custom make a gearbox the shape of the gun and then create space for a battery. Now obviously things have improved over time now. We've got this Lipo technology, which is small and powerful, which is fantastic, but we're still, you know, limited on some of these guns, especially with some of them like these recoil guns that utilize recoil weights in the back here. And whenever you have the opportunity to put a trigger fet in here and create battery space, even if it's just a little bit more and makes it a bit more convenient for you to install batteries, we always recommend people go for them over a normal basic MOSFET. However, if you don't have the option to install, which so many guns don't, there's not a trigger ETU MOSFET system, internal system for every single gun out there, unfortunately. Yeah, we can but hope, but unfortunately not here. Obviously, if it's just a monetary reason that you're going for the cheaper MOSFETs, they just don't. Yeah, so it's just save up, get the ETU MOSFET, you'll create so much more space, if you know what I mean, in your gun, which is worth the money in itself. Yeah, being able to easily fit a battery and not have to sort of, you know, shoehorn it in around a MOSFET all the time. So it's I think technology moved on enough to make that a safe, you know, thing to say to people. So you always go for the MOSFETs, and obviously in this particular case, they've eventually gone, I think, for a Gate Titan, which is obviously a better thing, but they've still struggled there. And just according to the paperwork, they've struggled with the selector plate, which we found out as well. It's got an aftermarket one, actually quite interesting, a metal selector plate on the side there. Obviously, the way the Titans work, they have reflective surfaces, which are picked up by optical sensors. and then you can obviously configure. So I think it was just too reflective, so we've dulled down basically around the plate selector, and so that the white is more reflective, and also and obviously everything around it's less reflective, and then we've ever so slightly moved it to the right, if you know what I mean, which did require a small modification of the selector plate in order to do that. That's now given us a lot more leeway for the selector to basically be so it's not accidentally knocked and triggers full auto. Now you can literally lean on it now and still not activate full auto, which is the kind of leeway that you should would like, if you know what I mean. So on these particular fire selectors, so they're not just accidentally flicked. So that's the benefit of the Gate Titan normally, that you can set that range on there, but obviously in some situations the sensor is just not picking it up well, so it's up to you then, the gun tech, if you know what I mean, to adjust that, if you know what I mean, to get it into the right position, or the installer of it. So yeah, so that fixed the fire selector issue. Everything else that was sort of described on here was things like the gun gets super hot after only 60 rounds. That's a very short period to obviously generate heat. Well, obviously any gun tech, or all gun techs know that obviously the reason it's generating heat is because it's having to do an incredible amount of work with high resistance. The analogy again to keep using cars would be trying to drive around everywhere with your handbrake on. Obviously the more resistance you create there, the more the engine has to work, the more heat the engine generates. It's exactly the same principle. So obviously if your motor is creating a huge amount of heat, it's having to work incredibly hard. The motor will keep pulling, it will keep trying to do what it's trying to do, and that ultimately then creates more draw, which creates more heat on the motor, and just generally eventually will build up heat, because it essentially works like a heat sink, so for building up and holding heat, and then trying to dissipate it, but it obviously is building it up fast that it can dissipate. So that's why they get hot. So in theory, it shouldn't be something we should have to actually focus on trying to fix. So obviously every single gun that comes in we rebuild from scratch, so therefore we're taking each part out, tipping it onto the floor, onto the desk, and then rebuilding it back up, if you know what I mean. So to make sure that the shimmy is correct, that once it's built up, the gearbox is amp tested to make sure that everything is as low as it possibly can be. Obviously if it's getting a high reading on there, then obviously we have to investigate why it's getting a high reading. Is it shimming? Is it just a really poor quality motor, you know? So sometimes the motor can create a lot of resistance there, so it's not actually coming from the gearbox. So obviously we rebuilt it, and it passed our test straight away. So we can only assume, because obviously we're not going to go in and try and figure out exactly where that's going to, it takes time. We can only assume that the reason it was getting incredibly hot was because it was just shimmed too tight or something like that. Another thing we had issues with was the large amounts of parts of the gearbox and low receiver and stock that all had holes cut in them. So it's just, you know, there's just no reason at all, if you know what I mean, to do that. I mean, obviously part of it was probably trying to shoehorn the gate MOSFET in there. Again, why we recommend having something that goes in the gearbox rather than trying to fit it, you know, in everywhere around it. Obviously that then meant that there were sort of parts missing in the stock. All this area out here was cut in the stock. Just, you know, just if we was to sell a brand new Scar, we just wouldn't do any of that. And obviously what we're trying to do, and sometimes what needs to be done with talking to customers, is obviously direct them to the correct way rather than just try and shoehorn in what they're adamant that they want to fit in there. Yeah, so obviously in this particular instance, I think it was being used on 8.4 volt batteries. So what we're insisting obviously with the customer is that it just moves straight over to 7.4 Lipo, and because that's going to be way quicker than the 8.4 volt NIMS, and a faster technology and easier technology to charge. And then obviously that's going to be combined with the Gate Titan, is going to give plenty of trigger response, as you'll see when we demonstrate this today. And yeah, and obviously what we did, we rewired from here backwards, all with new wiring, and we got it all nice and neat now. So it's all going through here rather than sort of before it was this kind of thing, wires going through there. Also obviously just, you know, pet peeve of mine is not to do connectors that are basically the same on both sides. It's just sort of standard electrical sort of 101. You know, you do opposing connectors. That way, if somebody is to come back in, or a customer, you give it to a customer and they accidentally pull it out and put it back themselves, that there's no sort of, I mean, I know there's a color code in there, but it's just an extra sort of safety thing to basically mean that you can't possibly put it in the wrong spot, because you know, sometimes people, you know, don't see the colors and you know, maybe they're colorblind or something and just put it back in the wrong things, and obviously that would cause, with a MOSFET installed, a fire. Yeah, so if they aren't able to get that off there quick enough. So another thing we installed is this button here was broken, this push button. We're assuming that that was travel related, so obviously we can only apologize, I guess, you know, on behalf of you know, that happening, but unfortunately it's obviously travelled a long way and been kicked about quite a bit, so but we've obviously fit a new button on there for you, if you know what I mean. We might as well take the opportunity to do that. So we also installed Prometheus gears, because obviously we're taking the opportunity to really make sure that this build hopefully isn't going to go wrong for you again in the future, and you just get really a lot of longevity out of it. Obviously you've already got to install the Firefly hot rubber, upgraded barrels. So obviously when we did the range testing, everything was going fine there, you know, with regards to that. So we don't see any reason to sort of interfere with what you got going on there. So like I say, it was passing the tests. FPS wise, for you, we've got 398 on 0.2s. I mean, technically we could have gone a little bit more, but I think that's nice and safe. Obviously the requirement was below 1.6 joules of energy being produced. That puts us, like I say, about 1.49, 5, you know, for that particular ammo. So we think, you know, it's pretty good to be out. I suppose technically we could eke out a tiny bit more, but obviously it's quite complicated with SCAR with regards to spring fitting, and especially around the 400 mark, because there's quite big jumps between springs at that sort of stage. It's just the nature of how springs are made. It's harder to have smaller increments at the higher ends, because you know, they're just so few sales, if you know what I mean, on the bigger springs. It just doesn't warrant having such a large range. So yeah, and then so 309 FPS on 3.2s. So that's like I say again, around about it's around about 4.5 joules. So again, you know, it's not fully maximizing, if you know what I mean, so every tiny eke of potential, but obviously traveling at you know, 310 feet per second on arguably the heaviest ammo that AEGs can push, if you know what I mean. It's you know, it's getting into sort of what we would consider in the UK sniper territory, and sniper sort of type of FPS levels. So yeah, to be able to use that on full auto in your country, you know, that's is plenty from our perspective. You know, so yeah, you'll be able to send the 3.2s very quickly. Obviously, I don't think you actually allow 3.2s in your particular country, but obviously we've done that on that. And so yeah, so you know, like I say, we'd recommend the heaviest ammo that you can go to, which I believe is 3s. And obviously your speed to target there is going to be, you know, around about 330, 340 FPS on 3 ammo, which is, you know, in the UK we'd be dropping down to around sort of 260. So it's a massive advantage, if you know what I mean, compared to any of the players in the UK shooting full auto in your country, you know. So so yeah, it's a solid build. It's the kind of build, yeah, you would like I say, you're getting DMR performance, but you have full auto. It's obviously that's the benefit of playing Airsoft in your country. So yeah, it's very cool. So yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Obviously you completely redone the stock wiring, moved over to Dean's. We now recommend the 7.4 1800 milliamp hour battery. We have tightened the selector on the side. We replaced the missing screw on the grip. obviously we completely redid the wiring. We also found that the original piston head had come off. So obviously it's important when fitting piston heads to put a little bit of Loctite on there so that they don't come off, and then obviously give that Loctite a period of time to actually set, because it is possible to do the build, obviously Loctite everything up, and then pretty much straight away afterwards get straight onto a testing, and then obviously everything's moving at a high speed. It's possible that the Loctite hasn't even set at that point, in which case it can sort of unwind through vibrations there and then, which then in turn creates problems further down the road. It can be time consuming teching, and actually doing things in air quotes right, so given that time to set puts you back. You almost have to pretty much put it away for it to then set and dry, which is not necessarily possible, depending on different techs' timetables, and maybe they're under pressure, if you don't mean, to get a certain amount of guns done per day, that kind of thing. So it can be tough. So like I say, we don't like to judge, we're just putting the information out there on how to fix it, really. So ready for range testing. Yep, so obviously done range testing. Selector issue was fixed. So the Prometheus bearings that were provided with us were massive. They were 8mm, I think, or 7mm, something like that. So we're not in a position where we're comfortable to offer enlarging services yet, if you know what I mean. So not en masse, if you know what I mean. So we basically opted for the 6mm bearings to be fit instead, so which is pretty standard for us to ever so slightly enlarge to get to the 6mm, but obviously going from 6 to 7 is a different story altogether. So we didn't want to risk that. So if it's okay, we've installed the Prometheus bearings. So that's pretty much it, really. So we got it all back together again, so it's all shooting nicely and stuff. Just make sure it's still going. Yep, so I'm talking for ages. Bolt catch didn't work, so I mean, with regards to the bolt, actually it goes into the same territory as the rebuild. Something's got to be pretty majorly wrong for us to not be able to put guns that we build daily back together correctly, and not have it work. So there was nothing massively off there. It either wasn't set properly in the gate tighten, or it wasn't physically installed properly. So one or the other that's created that. And yeah, you've written down on his selector, so yeah, we found that, and like I say, we tightened the one on the side ever so slightly, but there was still a certain amount of movement, possibly because of the aftermarket selector plate, or possibly just because it's a used gun. It's created a little bit of movement, but it has a little bit, see there, and obviously that has the potential to then obviously be picked up by the sensors on the MOSFET, so we addressed that. Yeah, so today I'm going to test on the 1600, which I'll show you in here. Okay, so your wiring, what we did is we installed the fuse holder back in there. We had a spare one. So the benefit of this fuse holder is it holds all this wiring down, so when the customer's sort of installing the battery, they can't sort of pull it accidentally and then therefore yank the wiring, so that they then unplug these connectors. So obviously some people have got solutions where they directly wire or remove those connectors or solder them or something, but there's just no need. Just the reason TM's bolted this down is so that people can't do that. So which is obviously quite a good idea by them. So obviously 1600, so not as powerful as what's potentially possible in there. You can squeeze up to a 2200 if you really wanted to, but we'd probably recommend the 18 because it just gives a nice sort of free moving without it being sort of a somewhat of a difficult thing getting it out there. But that then obviously fits in there, and then basically you just put your wire there, and then you put your butt pad on. just a bit of a negotiation to get the wires. Because you may have to make sure they're obviously not being blocked by this pin. So if you feel like that they're pressing against it, just move them to a different position and push through there. Don't force it, so because obviously you'll damage the silicon heat shrink on the wires. So that's pretty much it really. So now obviously your stock, obviously moves properly. So a little bit tight because obviously the way we've done the rewiring is never quite as perfect as the lovely lush way TM do it, and they used to bend all their wires so they lovely collapse and stuff. But it's still fully adjustable, and obviously if you want to, you can move your stock over it. And obviously everything's nice and neat here, if you know what I mean, so it doesn't get caught when you're folding the stock. And we can do it. So shoot. So as you can see, the obviously trigger response is nice and quick. So in terms of trigger response, obviously we were discussing, moving, all the way from one extreme, 8.4 volts and poor performance, to 11 volt. And the reason we say we don't need 11 volt is just there, that demonstration. That's the combination of the MOSFET combined with 7.4 volt. I basically almost can't pull that fast enough, and bear in mind this is at 400 FPS as well, so it's it's not exactly like it's a low powered build. That's putting obviously more strain on everything, creating more work. Yet it's still that instantaneous trigger response, and I don't know, me personally, I think that's good. If not, let me know. And obviously we can obviously discuss trying to get it faster, but me personally, I think we're pretty dialed in with that particular quick trigger response. And I think just the previous build, obviously, just if there was huge restriction going there on the gearbox previously, creating huge amounts of heat, that was probably going slow, probably creating obviously loads of strain on the battery, and especially if it's 8.4, I would imagine it would have been very, very slow. You've probably been in like the 11 rounds per second territory, 12, so which is hard to even use at that sort of rounds per second. Everything would have been slow. If there was no MOSFET, it would have been locking up all the time. So yeah, obviously, fitting the MOSFET, obviously the correct wiring, and 7.4, just 1600, and away it goes. So, but we'll get some more demo in, so you can obviously make a decision for yourself. go. So obviously all your fire selector's working, obviously stock's working, we've tested its folding, still working after that. Everything's all tight. Obviously I think the rate of fire is plenty, and I think that the trigger response is plenty, but that's obviously my opinion, so feel free to let me know what you think. And if this all meets your standards, then obviously we can get it sent back to you. If not, let us know and we can obviously make any alterations you need. Yeah, I think that's pretty good as is. So yeah, feel free to let us know, and obviously I think that covers everything. Yeah, and obviously we'll catch you guys in the next video, so thank you.